On May 23, 1985, 14-year-old Jody Lee Ledkins, who lived in Kansas City, Missouri, would leave her friend Melissa Folscroft's home in the hopes of getting a ride back to her parents' house. Jody was last seen walking northbound on Winchester Avenue and 14th Street in the direction of her boyfriend's home, a 14-minute walk from her friend Melissa's house. In the years since, her mother would receive a handwritten letter that was supposedly from her daughter, as well as a series of threatening phone calls from a group that had claimed to have taken Jody hostage. In 1997, Jody's case would be reclassified from a missing persons case into a probable homicide. There were several leads that would come from two prison inmates who would claim that Jody's body could be found inside of a car at the bottom of the Mississippi River. The river was searched, but neither the car nor Jody was ever found. In today's video, we'll be re-examining the nearly 40-year-old mystery of what really happened to 14-year-old Jody Lee Ledkins. Born on September 20th, 1970, Jody Lee Ledkins was the second youngest child of Karen Stratton and Marvin Eugene Ledkins. Jody's early life would not be without its fair share of challenges, as her parents would divorce in 1981, with her mother marrying a different man. Several years later, they would divorce again, and Karen would go back to Jody's father, Marvin Ledkins. A year prior to her disappearance, Jody would push a security guard, which would result in her being assigned a parole officer. Jody had previously run away from home on 3 separate occasions, although she would eventually return back each time. She also had a habit of being truant and would skip school on the morning of Thursday, May 23, 1985. Jody would spend the day hanging around with her friend, Melissa Folscroft. At some point in the afternoon, the girls and Melissa's mother would travel down the road to visit Jody's boyfriend, a young man by the name of Glenn Williams. Glenn lived just over a half a mile away from the Folscroft home, a roughly 14-minute walk from their house. While at her boyfriend's home, Jody would get into an argument with Glenn, which would result in the girls heading back to Melissa's house. At 10 o'clock in the evening, Jody would call her mother and would request a ride back to her house. Her mother was unable to give her daughter a ride back home because she didn't have access to the family car. However, Jody seemed to be okay with the situation and told her mom that she would get a ride back home from one of her friends. Shortly after this, she would be seen leaving the Folscroft home and walking northbound on Winchester Avenue in the direction of her boyfriend's house. This would be the last known sighting of Jody Lee Ledkins. When it comes to a disappearance case like this, which appears to be very open-ended, I think it's important to consider all the possibilities as to why Jody Lee Ledkins went missing on this particular night. Based on the information that's been provided, I was able to come up with 5 theories on why this happened. Theory number 1. While walking back to her boyfriend's house, Jody was abducted by one or more people who had nefarious intentions in mind. In this particular scenario, I think it's extremely unlikely that Jody would have survived the encounter with her abductors. Theory number 2. Jody actually chose to run away from home. I consider this to be a possible explanation, as her life at the time might have been a bit difficult for her to manage. It's also been said by her brother Paul that her father was physically abusive, and that she might have been afraid of the ramifications that she would have faced for skipping school. I don't consider this to be the most likely scenario, but I do believe that it's still a possibility. Theory number 3. Jody made it to her boyfriend's house, but because of the argument that they had had earlier, or perhaps because of a different reason altogether, it resulted in Jody meeting with harm, and most likely death. Theory number 4. Jody never left the Folscroft home. Instead, they kept her there for a period of time before she eventually decided to run away on her own, or perhaps she came into harm while she was at the house. Theory number 5. While walking along Winchester Avenue, Jody was accidentally struck by a car. Fearing legal repercussions, the driver of the car took her body and buried her somewhere that has not been discovered even to this very day. I believe that the fate of Jody Lee Ledkins ultimately lies within the context of these 5 different scenarios. One thing that I do find to be particularly interesting is that her friend initially said that Jody had left in the direction of her boyfriend's house, but she later changed her story and said that Jody was actually walking back towards her home. Jody's boyfriend lived only 14 minutes walking distance from the Folscroft home. Her brother Paul Ledkins would later say in an interview that he had gone over to the boyfriend's house about 2 days after Jody had gone missing, only for the boyfriend to tell him that Jody Lee Ledkins had just left his house. According to Paul, he was there on that night when the girls were over at Glenn's house, because Jody's boyfriend was actually one of his best friends and they were hanging out together. If Jody had in fact made it to her boyfriend's house, then why wouldn't she have called her parents to let them know that she wasn't able to get a ride back and would be spending the night at his house instead? Why wouldn't she have gone back home the following day? Another thing that must be considered in all of this is the rumor that Jody was pregnant at the time of her disappearance, and the man whose child she was pregnant with was none other than her boyfriend, Glenn Williams. This in and of itself does not give a reason for why Jody would go missing. However, it does provide another dimension to the story and could potentially explain why someone might have wanted her out of the picture. It's been more than 37 years since Jody Ledkins was last seen, but I really do believe that this case is solvable and that someone out there has the information as to what happened to her. If alive today, Jody would be 52 years old. If you have any information as to what happened to Jody Lee Ledkins on the night of May 23rd, 1985, please contact CUE, Center for Missing Persons, at 910-343-1131, or call the CUE Center 24-hour tip line at 910-232-1687. Remember that all information submitted to the CUE, Center for Missing Persons, is confidential.